It's a blessing again today to welcome our friends at Miracle Mile and Watkins, Glen, and those of you that watch online. We're so happy that you're with us today. Let's welcome each other right now. If you have been with us for the past couple weeks, we have launched a series having to do with spiritual armor, as Paul discusses it in Ephesians chapter 6. And just this past week, we began a new Bible study at Watkins Glen, Tuesdays at noon. Just a little commercial, guys. If anybody can join us, we'd love to have you. We've had around 11 guys come out for Bible study on Tuesday. And we just started studying the parables of Jesus. And the study book explains that a parable is essentially an extended metaphor. It's an illustration that's extended or extensive, if you will. And that's really what Paul is doing with the spiritual armor as we read about it in Ephesians 6. He's picked this metaphor, this illustration, and he's developing it beyond just a passing reference. And so my hope is to inspire you to dig with me as deeply as we can into these different pieces of spiritual armor. What I say is just the tip of the iceberg. I think you probably will have insights that are profound, and I encourage you to share them with me as you come up with them. As Paul mentioned the spiritual armor, he was using an example that the people of his day would have been familiar with. Yes, Paul is in the jail with this Roman soldier attached to his wrist all the time, but they were very familiar being an occupied country with these Roman soldiers everywhere and seeing them in their fancy armor. You know, the Jews didn't have armor like that, but these guys did. And so we're going to look at that again today. And before I'm going to invite you to read with me the verses you have in your notes. But before we get to that, I want to go back and read 3 verses leading up to chapter 6, verse 13. In chapter 6, verse 10, he says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." Stand is a theme that continues here. He says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." He's saying this is spiritual warfare that we're really about. And then to pick up with me, we'll read the rest from your notes there before you. Let's read together. "Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." And I hope you'll remember where that is. What is the address of this passage? Ephesians 6, 13 through 17. And as I said before, if you don't remember these verses word for word, I hope you at least have the concept of the pieces of the armor. Now this concept this week, I've called the shoes of peace. It doesn't actually say shoes of peace, but it's implied. What about the shoes of peace? The New Living Translation, we have that verse 15 goes like this: For shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news, so that you will be fully prepared. So shoes are implied when he says, fit yourself to go into warfare. It's important to dress your feet carefully. I was reminded, some of you remember John Wooden, a famous basketball coach of UCLA, the best basketball coach ever, probably. And every fall, when the new players would arrive, he would make the returning upperclassmen, as well as the newest players, do the same thing. He would teach them how to put on their socks and their shoes. Can you imagine that? Here's grown men, they're 18, 19 years old, and he made them go through the drill every year. You put your socks on very carefully. You make sure there's no loose piece of cloth by your little toe or by your heel. But it's so important. And then he taught them how to lace up the sneakers, and how to make sure everything was just so. And he didn't want to overlook even the slightest detail. And I guess it got results. I mean, in 12 years, he won 10 national championships. Think of that. 7 years in a row, UCLA won the national tournament. So he knew what he was doing. And he said, he lived to be almost 100 years old. He said in his later years, it's the little details that make the big things come around. And I think about that. And when we're thinking about the armor, probably we wouldn't think that much about the shoes or the footwear. But Paul did. And I'd like to just lift up to you what he says. You have a little picture there in your notes. And if you look carefully, more on the guy that's on your left than the right, you see the sandals go up and they're laced around the ankle. So they were made of 3 layers of leather, and they were intended to be comfortable and as blister-proof as they could be. And a friend of mine who will go nameless, some of you might figure out who he is, happens to sell sandals in his store. And he says he really wished he could have cornered the market on keen sandals for the Romans back then. He could have really made a killing. Oh, another deal. Oh, man, do you know who that would be? I don't know. And then I said to him when he said that, well, what if you had a Naot franchise? The Naot sandals are very good, and they're made in Israel, but he said they're too expensive. You get a better deal on the Keens. But Paul says, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. While footwear might be the last thing we think about, it's important for Paul to emphasize these. And these sandals were the soldiers' battle shoes. And besides going to battle, they probably would put hundreds of miles on a pair of sandals, and not to have blisters and not to have men with sore feet. And then when they're fighting hand-to-hand combat, they had to be sure that their footwear would be reliable. The sandals were usually studded with nails or spikes that went down through the bottom, like cleats would be today. They called them hobnails. And it was important for the person to keep his balance if he's in battle. If you fall, you're done for. You're down and you're vulnerable, but you had to keep your footing. Solid footing was essential. And I think about that today. The best athletes are very good with their footwork. They have a good balance, and they don't waste any effort with their feet. They know right where their feet need to be. Golfers of the status of John Dunlap, I mean, their footwork's very important, or whether it's basketball or football or whatever, tennis, your footwork is so very important. I think some of these athletes are natural and they just know what to do, but they're trained also with the way they use their feet. So we looked already at Paul mentioning the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness. Now he comes to the feet, and he says, and with your feet fitted. Now I just happen to have from this friend that has the shoe store one of these here. It's called a Brannock device. Remember, these go way back, probably as old as some of you are. You remember these from when you were a kid. I learned that this was invented in 1925, which is probably back further than most of you. And it was by a man named Brannock, surprise, surprise. He was 22 years old, and he worked in his father's shoe store in Syracuse, New York. So this came from Syracuse. And that's important to use that because the literature that comes with the Brannock device, and I have 6 pages of it here that tells you how to use the device, says that 50% of people are wearing the wrong shoe, wearing the wrong size shoe, and they don't even realize it. So if you read it in depth, you would learn that you need to measure from the heel to the ball of the foot and be sure that the arch of the shoe lines right up with the ball of the foot. And did you know that some of you are short-toed and others are long-toed? I never really thought. How many of you? No, I won't ask for a show of hands. But the length of your toes has a bearing on the size of your footwear. And if you don't get it right, foot problems occur, and lots of pain and lots of other issues if your feet aren't comfortable. So he says, with your feet fitted. And then what's the next part of that? With the readiness. What's readiness? It's careful preparation. It's constant vigilance, whether it's a matter of putting your socks on and your shoes on, or you're ready. You're not caught flat-footed. You're not caught unprepared, barefooted when you have to go to battle. Nowadays, orthotics are quite the rage, and you go to specialized doctors called podiatrists, and they have computerized fitting. Now, do you ever do that? You step in this foam, and then I guess it hardens. I don't know, and they ship it off and charge you a lot of money, and they give you your shoes afterwards. So, being ready, careful preparation. When I think about that, I have a spiritual application, how we need to be constantly vigilant and prepared in our life with God. One of my favorite little songs that we sing is In the Secret. You know the words, in the secret, in the quiet place, in the stillness, you are there. In the secret, in the quiet hour, I wait only for you because I want to know you more. You have that relationship with the Lord. That's preparation and readiness for your life. So when he speaks of readiness, I think of that. A few additional insights or thoughts came to me about feet and how many times we can think of them in the Bible. And I didn't do an extensive research. These just kind of came to me, and I'm just kind of winging it with you right now. But I think of Moses' call in Exodus, chapter 3, I think it is, when he's been watching his father-in-law's sheep for 40 years, and then suddenly one day he notices this bush is burning and it's not being consumed, and he gets closer to the bush, and he hears God's voice, Moses, take off your shoes because you're on holy ground. For God to prepare Moses for the next chapter of his life, he needed to take his shoes off and be prepared to be ready for what God had for him next. I think when Moses went to Pharaoh, he probably had his shoes on again. You know, he probably had his sandals on. It doesn't really say, but God had to prepare him and get him ready for that next very important call. Moses was being fitted and readied and prepared for what God had for him next. And Moses was by nature pretty insecure and unsure of himself. You know, here I am, send Moses, or here I am, send Aaron, he wanted to say. But God helped him be prepared with an assurance that he had to step up, and he was the leader. He was the one that the Jews depended on when he led them out of the wilderness. I think also of Jesus preparing the 12 as he's about to be arrested and tried and crucified. What does he do? He washes their feet. He wants their feet to be prepared. He wants them to be ready. I think of Mary, right in those at the same time, just before the Last Supper, who takes the expensive nard or ointment and washes his feet and wipes them with her hair. She's preparing his feet. And when Judas objected, why are you wasting all that money? He said, she's preparing me for my burial. And how does she do that? By preparing his feet, no less. Is that kind of weird to think about in a way? I think of other examples where Jesus sent the 72 out 2 by 2 to go into the villages before them. And in both Matthew and Luke's gospel, we see this. And he says, if somebody receives you, stay with them. If they reject you, leave that village and do what? Shake the dust off your feet. Again, the feet have something to do with that. Don't take that contaminated dust of rejection and disbelief with you, but shake it off. I think of an expression for people that were followers of a teacher or a rabbi, including Jesus, is they walked in the dust of their rabbi. They walked in the dust of the sandals, the dust kicked up by their rabbi, by their teacher. And isn't that an example, a definition, explanation of a disciple, is you walk in the dust of Jesus. You're that intimately associated in close fellowship with Jesus. I think of Mary and Martha in Luke 10, where Martha is frazzled and she's so busy about the kitchen and she's ticked at her sister Mary because she's not helping. And she complains to Jesus, and Jesus says, oh, Martha, Martha, you're worried about all these things. Mary has chosen the better part. Where is Mary when he says that? Where is she sitting? At his feet. So there's some great symbolism there when we talk about our feet being prepared. So he says, back to Ephesians 6, with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel. What is the gospel? The gospel is the good news of Jesus Christ. It's, that expression, well, that is just too good to be true. Well, the gospel is good, and it is true, and it's unbelievable, but it's a wonderful message. The gospel itself is the firm footing of who we are as Christ followers. That's what we're fitted with. That's what we understand. The word gospel is in the Greek language, it's euangelion. Say that with me. Euangelion. I know it's kind of an obscure word. We get the word evangelism from that. Evangelism is to share the good news. And so we euangelion the people. It's more than just knowing about God in some kind of a religious, theological sense. It's experiential. We know Jesus, and we want to share Jesus with other people. More than knowing about, we know Jesus, and we want to take the gospel to our world. I think this week, this evening, we start Vacation Bible School at Miracle Mile. And we have an opportunity by reaching out to, who's Frank, by the way? Do you know who Frank is? Friends, relatives, associates, neighbors, kids. With an emphasis on the kids, who can you invite yet today to come out this afternoon for the first day of VBS? How can we, just last week we had some prayer walks in anticipation of VBS. We had people go out 2 by 2. Did you instruct them to shake the dust off their feet if they got a bad reception? Maybe not. But we're called to go out and share the gospel, the good news with our world, to take the gospel to our world even this week with Vacation Bible School. If you don't get them to come Sunday night, maybe they'll come Monday. Keep inviting them. Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. There's that preparation theme. Be prepared so that if somebody asks, you have an answer to share with them, that you're not caught flat-footed, unprepared. Paul says in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show yourselves approved of God. That study often appears in the secret, in the quiet times. But when you study and you dig deeply into what it is to know Jesus Christ and what the gospel means, this is a corny play on words. I mean, they're all corny for me, but study means that you're studying your sandals. You're putting studs in. You're getting traction because you've invested and you have the depth to you that your traction is not like a slick, like a racing slick that's got no tread at all, but you're getting tread. You're getting traction. You have studded snow tires. How's that? I don't want to talk about snow tires in August. So he says, feet fitted with a readiness that comes from the gospel of what? Of peace. Now, my friend that wanted to go nameless, that talked about measuring feet and getting it just right, I noticed that he has an ice cream store. Now, Fredna spent time in Watkins. I would dare say, this last week, I dare say she visited Ben & Jerry's. Is that so? Gilly would be disappointed in you. They have the big sign over Ben & Jerry's that says peace, love, and ice cream. Now, is that the extent of peace that we're talking about here? No, it's the gospel of peace. And it's, sorry, Jim, but it's far more important than just ice cream. Paul, what's that? She went to the shoe store, Jim. So does that qualify? Paul is in prison when he writes Ephesians. I shared with you before. He also wrote Philippians from prison. And it's in Philippians 4:7 that he talks about this gospel of peace, and about the peace especially when he says, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. So the peace of God is what guards us. And I shared with you a while back that word for guard, as guard your hearts, is the same word for the guard that he's chained to wrist, that just like that Roman soldier was guarding Paul, more importantly, God's peace was guarding him, his hearts and his minds. And he says that's true for all of us. We have the gospel of peace, which brings assurance of salvation. I like to say, you know that you know that you know. You don't have to doubt. You don't have to say, if I were to be run over by a Mack truck tonight, I hope I'd go to heaven. But you have an assurance about that. And that's a mark of a Christian, to be sure of your faith. It's a reassuring confidence that is good for spiritual warfare, but it's also good for times when times are at peace as well. So, I was reading from Ecclesiastes 3. Remember the song, Turn, Turn, Turn. At the end of that passage in Ecclesiastes 3 is a time for war and a time for peace. So what we're talking about is that we're fitted with preparation for times of war and for times of peace. Now, there's 3 prison letters right in a row. It's Ephesians, Philippians, and then Colossians. I have a few words to share with you from Colossians, and you'll see them. Would you read them with me from your notes? They are Colossians 3:12 through 15. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you were called to peace. So I want you to appreciate that. And that's a different way. He's in prison. Maybe the same Roman guard is attached to his wrist as before. I don't know. This time, in this case, he doesn't use the armor, but he talks about putting on clothes of compassion and kindness and humility. But you see, it's the same essential point, isn't it? And that last verse there, Colossians 3:15, says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. The word there could be translated, let the peace of Christ act as umpire in your hearts. If you have a peace about something, that's your umpire. You Yankee fans, you know that your man, Aaron Boone, had a dispute with an umpire a few weeks ago. Maybe he's had more since then. I'm not sure. And he doesn't have the gracious way about him that your previous manager had, just saying. But the umpire rules, and he didn't want to let the umpire rule, and guess who got kicked out of the game? It wasn't the umpire. But you let the peace of Christ rule, call the shots, say the balls and strikes or the outs, and when the peace rules, you know what you're supposed to do by that. So I lift that up to you as a understanding of peace there. And it says, as members of one body, you were called to peace. That's what we're called to, the gospel of peace. One last verse. This comes from Paul's writing as well, from Romans 10:15. Read that with me. How beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things. So we read that and we read about the gospel of peace, and I would ask you in closing, how is your footing? Is your footing based on the solid belief and grounded in the gospel of peace? May it be so. Amen.